Number 1. Country Walk. I lived for a while in an Ohio town that wasn't far from Wheeling, West Virginia. This was a long time ago, and I only lived there for about a year. So I'm having a really hard time trying to remember the name of it, but that's not important though. I was 13 years old at the time. I had an older brother and a younger sister, but I really didn't like being around my parents at the time, so I was really happy during the summer that year when I got to stay for a month at my aunt's house. She lived out in the country, as my family always put it, although I always thought that sounded weird. I mean, technically, doesn't everyone live in their country? This was back in the 1980s, so there wasn't as much readily available entertainment as there is today. We would get to have a frozen pizza every Friday and go into town to rent videos. He and I would always opt for cheesy 80s horror movies and stay up really late. I saw a lot of straight-to-VHS horror movies that summer, but for the rest of the days, we would have to make our own entertainment. It was particularly hot in the house that day. My aunt only had a couple fans, and they weren't doing the best job that day. There was a breeze outside, and it was actually much cooler for us to be outside, so we decided to go for a walk. The road my aunt lived on was paved with gravel. She lived in a very beautiful rural area, with very few homes. The road was pleasant to walk down during the summer because it was at the bottom of many hills, which had tons of trees on them. At this time of the day, the trees were casting their shadow on the road, making it actually the coolest place that my cousin and I could be at the time. We were walking for a while, and as I mentioned before, there was a cool and consistent breeze that day. I would say the wind was probably at 16 miles per hour, and we were having a nice time just talking about things. My cousin stopped walking, and he suddenly had a very odd look on his face. He looked off into the trees on the hill. I asked him if something was wrong. He took a moment and responded, "I don't know. I thought I just heard something, but I'm not sure." He sort of narrowed his eyes, as if he was looking for something up on the hill. After a moment, he just shook his head. The two of us started walking again. It was Friday afternoon, and once my aunt got home from work, we were going to go and pick up our videos for the night. So we were discussing what we wanted to watch. I very distinctly remember that he wanted to watch The Monster Squad, which I reminded him wasn't really a horror movie. Then we both heard some noises coming from the trees. It was not just the sound of footfalls crunching on the leaves, but we also heard someone who sounded like they were breathing heavy. We finally saw something too. Maybe about 20 feet ahead of us, we saw someone suddenly burst out of the trees. It was a man much bigger and older than us, and he was dressed in shabby clothing. I remember clearly that he was wearing a denim jacket and what looked like a denim baseball cap as well. But that was not what stood out most about the man. He looked like he was covered in blood. He also seemed panicked, but then was shocked to see us when he looked over at us. I could understand why. There was a lot of forest around there, and not a lot of people. Running out onto the road, more often than not, would not be around other people. He seemed unsure of what to do and just looked at us for a moment. We were frozen in place, also not sure what to do. The man then moved, as if he was going to come at us, but he quickly stopped himself. He seemed to rethink his choice, and instead, he turned and he ran off in the other direction. We didn't follow him, as the two of us were really scared. Remember, we had been watching a lot of scary movies that summer, and that seemed like a scene right out of one of them. The last thing we needed to do was follow someone who might be crazy, dangerous, or both. My cousin thought that maybe the guy had killed someone in the woods, and he suggested that we should go and see if someone was out there. If the man had attacked someone and that someone was still alive, then maybe we could help him. I agreed, and besides, we were two 13-year-old boys who needed some adventure. So we started up the hill in the area we had seen the man run down from. I would like to tell you that I was brave, but honestly the experience was rather terrifying. I kept expecting the man to come back behind us or something like that. We got to the top of that hill, and we were making our way down the other side, hoping to find something. Eventually we did find something, but it completely changed what we had perceived had happened. There was a creek not too far from where we were, and there was another huge guy over by the creek. He had his back turned to us, but we could tell what he was doing. He had a large hunting knife, and he was cleaning it in the creek. We didn't have to say anything to each other. We both realized what we were seeing and what might have actually happened. We also realized that we might have been in trouble. As quiet as we could, we crept behind 2 trees. However, still curious, the 2 of us kept looking out from behind the tree at the man by the creek. We were very fortunate that he hadn't appeared to notice us. After the guide cleaned his knife off and dried it off, he sheathed it, and then he fortunately took off in the opposite direction of us. I breathed a sigh of relief because the guy was even bigger and even scarier looking than the guy we had seen out on the road. Once the guy was gone, we still waited a while before heading back down the hill. We had seen enough scary movies to know you never know if the killer would come back. We didn't feel safe until we got back down to the road, and once we did, we then hurried back to the house. We told my aunt and uncle what we had seen. Strangely, they weren't too concerned. They still slept with the house unlocked, as they always did. I really never found out what happened in that situation, but it was much scarier than any of the movies that we had watched. Number 2. Back room. My grandma and grandpa lived in a very old house. I think it used to be a 1-room schoolhouse way back in the day. They put up walls, and there was an upstairs sort of attic that was a living quarters, I guess. And my grandpa himself built a sort of addition on the back of the house. But the addition was really flimsy. It was literally just built with boards. There was no outside siding, there was no insulation, and there was no drywall on the inside. But it did have a window that faced into the backyard. The reason I am telling you about that room is that whenever we took the trip to Grandma and Grandpa's house, that was the room that I slept in. And I have to admit, it was a pretty freaky place to sleep. The house was in the opening to a holler. When you looked back through the window, you were looking into a beautiful countryside. But at nighttime, you were looking at a dark and very frightening scene. There were no lights in the back of the house at all. When you were in the room, however, your eyes would get used to the dark. But when it did, the things you would see back there were mostly shadowy movements, like tree branches blowing in the wind. So this happened in the winter when I was 15 years old. My family drove to Grandma's house, and we got there a couple hours before bedtime. That was normally what we did. We would watch Jeopardy, eat dinner, and go to bed not long after it. One thing I remember was, when my grandpa got up to go do something at one point, I began rocking his chair back and forth with my foot. This is a big no-no with my very superstitious grandparents. They always felt that if you rocked an empty chair in the house, that it would cause someone to die soon. So my grandma looked worried, and the look on her face told me that I should stop doing that. All my life, I have been the type to stay up late at night, and then sleep late in the morning. I like being up at night. My mind seems to work better when I'm awake at night. So I went to my room when everyone else went to bed, but I didn't go to sleep right away. I stayed up for a while, reading a book by the not-so-bright lamp in the back room. It was pretty cold that night, but that didn't bother me. The bed in the back room had heavy quilts on it, in order to keep warm. There was also an old space heater that I could use if it got way too cold for me, but that was rare. There's something nice about laying down in the cold weather, warmed up by a ton of blankets. I even remember the book I was reading on that night. It was Pet Sematary by Stephen King. You know, I don't normally get scared by books, but this one was scary, and I admit that I was already a little bit scared. every time that I was in that room. But if I didn't want to be scared, I guess I wouldn't have been reading that book to begin with. As I read, I would occasionally look up and out the window, and the darkness added to the fear that I was feeling from the book. I'm not sure how long I stayed up reading, but if you've ever read that book before, you would understand why. I'm not the biggest fan of most of King's work, but there's something about the atmosphere of that book that pulled me into it. When I finally decided to go to sleep, I was thoroughly on edge. The lamp was right by the bed, and once I turned it off, everything was totally dark for a while. I knew I wouldn't fall asleep right away, because that is just not what I do. So I lay down and looked out the window and just thought for a while. I don't know when I dozed off, but I eventually did, and as usual, when I sleep somewhere other than my own bed, I tend to sleep in little blocks. I will wake up over and over again, just for a few moments, and then fall back to sleep. I was sleeping on my back facing the window, so the first time I woke up, I just looked at the window in the darkness. I could see a little better than before, for some reason, and I could see the branches of several trees swinging in the wind. After looking at them swaying for a few moments, I went back to sleep. The next time I woke up was pretty much the same thing. I just saw some swinging branches in the wind, and fell back to sleep. I'm not sure how many times I did this, until one time I woke up and looked out the window, and in addition to the tree this time, I saw something out by the window. It was a dark something, but it was looking in the window at me. It took me a few moments to realize that I wasn't asleep and dreaming this, and then I noticed that it looked like a hand was tapping on the window. I heard the tapping, and saw the hand pretty clearly at that point. I jumped up and out of bed in shock. I had to do everything I could not to yell out in shock. My impulse was to rush away from the window and out of the room, but I resisted that, looking back at the window. There was nothing there. I walked over to the window and looked out, trying to see if someone was out there or if they were running away or something like that, but I didn't see anything like that. It was just dark, and I could see trees blowing in the wind, and nothing else. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if I was still sleeping and had dreamed the whole thing, or if someone was outside of the house or what, but it took me a long time before I was able to go back to sleep. I told my family about it the next day. My grandma told me that I should not have ever rocked the chair without someone sitting in it. She suggested perhaps that something had come for me because I had done so. Well, I think that's ridiculous. However, it got me thinking if maybe my grandpa had done it, or something like that to teach me to respect their superstitious beliefs. If he did, he never admitted to it though. I wouldn't have put it past them. Number 3. Robbie. This is the story of the strangest thing that has ever happened to me in my life. At the time, I had lived in the suburbs of Chicago. I had just gotten my heart broken not long before this, and was trying to get back into the dating scene, if I could. And I was lonely, and I went for trying to meet someone online. I began talking to this guy named Robbie. He was a bit younger than me, which really wasn't something that I liked. I was in my late 20s and he was 20, and still lived at home with his parents. He was going to community college at the time. I would have normally dismissed him because of his age, but he was persistent talking to me, and he was very interesting. And he liked horror as much as I did. That really got me interested at the very least, to go and meet him. He lived in Wisconsin, but he lived in the rural part of the county that he lived in. I didn't have a GPS, and this was before smartphones, so I had a bit of trouble finding his place. But eventually I was able to find him and pick him up. I should mention that all I wanted to do was go and have dinner and talk. However, we were getting along very well. He hadn't seen nearly as many movies as I had, and by talking about a lot of the movies, he asked if I wanted to buy some and go back to his house and watch them. I was hesitant because he lived with his parents. I think you have probably figured out by now that I am a gay guy, which I should have mentioned at first, and I felt really uncomfortable going back to his house with his parents there, especially because he had already mentioned that they didn't know he was gay. They weren't gay positive at all, and he told me that he would tell them that I was just a friend passing through who needed a place to sleep and couldn't afford a hotel. He would tell them that he met me through his Christian youth group. He told me many things that he would tell his parents. You know, this really should have been like 1,000 red flags, give or take. I was extremely uncomfortable with the idea, but I was on the rebound and I really liked Robbie. So despite my apprehension, I decided to go along with it. We bought a couple of movies. I don't recall one of them, but the other was the remake of the movie House of Wax. And I mostly remember that because some of the weird shit that happened when we watched it. So after shopping, we drove out to his house again. As I mentioned before, he lived in a rural part of the county. His house was a pretty old house that sat on what I supposed used to be an old farm that was no longer tended to. The fact that the house was so isolated did not lend to me feeling any more comfortable at all. Things were stranger when I met his parents. I could tell right away that they didn't like me. I don't remember as much about the father, but the mother was very overbearing. I could tell right away that if they didn't know their son was gay, they at least suspected it strongly, and they were very, very against it. While we were watching the movie, I was sitting in a recliner that was sitting in the middle of the room. We had the lights off, of course, because we were watching a horror movie. And although the parents said they were going to bed, there were times when I would hear something behind me, and I would turn and see the mother lurking in the dark hallway behind us, watching us, and she would linger there for a while before deciding to leave. However, her absences wouldn't last very long, and she would literally creep back into the hallway, and she kept watching me. There was one very scary moment when we were watching House of Wax that I turned and noticed her back in the hallway again, and this time I saw her holding a kitchen knife in her hand. She held the handle in one hand and was lightly slapping the flat part of the blade on her other hand, and I knew she wasn't doing anything in the kitchen. Recall that she and her husband had supposedly gone to bed before Robbie and I were watching the first movie. This was scary because I knew that she knew I kept looking back and catching her there, and this was something that she wanted me to see. I really should have left after the movie was over, but Robbie didn't seem to be upset by anything that was going on, and for some reason, the idiot in me didn't leave. Robbie told his mom that we were going to go to sleep. He showed her that he made up a bed on the floor of his room for me to sleep on, and then he closed the door. He waited until she was gone, though, in order to lock the door. I lay down on the floor, still unnerved by what was going on. But Robbie didn't want me to really sleep on the floor. He asked me to come up into the bed and cuddle with him. I liked him a lot, but I'm sure everyone listening to this story can realize how dumb I had been by this point. I should have never gotten into the position that I was in, and it seemed that everyone was uncomfortable except for Robbie. I didn't sleep so well, and there were several times that I heard the doorknob being turned, as I knew the mom was checking to see if it was locked. She probably wanted to open the door to see if anything gay was going on. This happened no less than 5 times, and each time I just saw that woman with the knife in her hand. I somehow made it through the night. Somehow the way that his mother acted didn't seem to bother Robbie at all. He went through the entire experience acting like nothing had happened. He was also completely oblivious to the fact that his mom knew he was gay, and was willing to try and scare his date with a knife in order to keep him from being gay. I was able to leave the house the next day without encountering the mom again. Not long after, though, I got a call from Robbie. His mom told him I wasn't allowed to come back to the house, and he was really confused by this. It didn't matter. I would not have gone back to that house anyway. Strangely, not long afterward, Robbie decided he didn't want to be gay anymore. Last I knew of him, he was dating some girl in his church group. I really hope his mom didn't threaten him or something like that. The whole thing was just too weird and scary, and I was happy to not have to go through it again. Like an idiot, I looked him up on Facebook and found him. Honestly, what I found was pretty disturbing. It seems like he goes through these periods of acceptance and then suppresses them again, just like he did back then. He even supports conversion therapy and believes being gay can be cured, which is nonsense, of course. Having one's true identity suppressed can be the scariest thing of all. This was a kid who was severely brainwashed and doesn't have the slightest clue that he was. And that is truly terrifying. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.